welcome everyone to Bracewell's Fall Environmental Law Seminar. It's great to be with you, at least virtually. This is actually the last session in our fall virtual conference, and we're very grateful for your participation. We've gotten lots of feedback from you about it, and we appreciate the support. This last session is going to focus on infrastructure, the prospects for development projects in the new Congress, however that ends up looking, and in the new administration, and we're getting a taste of what that might look like in the recent nominations. And all of that against a backdrop of a business climate that has been shaped and colored by the COVID pandemic. Joining me today are two colleagues with an immense amount of insight on our topic. Liam Donovan from our Policy Resolution Group is a longtime legislative policy expert, a frequent commentator, and you probably heard him on a variety of podcasts and other ways he engages on behalf of clients and issues. And he has a lot of insight on the legislative realities that face us and the direction of some of the legislative conversation. And joining Liam is Eric Washburn, the CEO of Windward Strategies and a frequent collaborator with our Policy Resolution Group. He's a veteran from Congress. He served as legislative director to the Majority Leader Tom Daschle, was a senior advisor to Harry Reid, and Democratic staff director at Senate EPWs. So Eric is someone who really understands the energy and natural resources picture in Congress and the political dynamics there. As I mentioned, he's the CEO of Windward Strategies and has, beyond that, a long history in democratic politics and natural resource policy. So I'm really, really glad to have both Liam and Eric with us, and I'm going to ask some questions and really just spark a conversation among them and a little bit with me on the topic of infrastructure in the context of the new Congress and the new administration. After this conversation with Liam and Eric, I'm going to have a one-on-one conversation with Ann Navaro, and we're going to shift to Ann after the initial conversation in order to focus more on the regulatory picture. Obviously politically informed and policy informed, given her 25 years in the executive branch, where she occupied senior roles in the Justice Department at the Environment and Natural Resources Division, as well as at the Corps of Engineers and the Interior Department. And of course is now at Bracewell, and I'm proud to say of my colleague that this year she won and earned Law 360's Most Valuable Player Award, the MVP award for environmental lawyers nationally for the year 2020. So stay tuned for Ann's thoughts and commentary in a little bit. But let's get started with Liam and Eric. Gentlemen, welcome to you. It's good to have you.
Kevin, good to be here.
Great. Thanks, Kevin.
So let's jump right in. I think it's exciting to talk about Congress, even though, and perhaps even more so, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Liam, can you tell us, where do we stand? There's something like Georgia floating out there, and what really does that mean, and how important is that when you look ahead to what Congress might be doing on infrastructure?
Sure. I think 6 weeks after an election that confounded most of the expectations, I think on both sides, you have two parties that are still trying to figure out, one focused on what just happened, actually both in some ways, because parts of the Republican Party are trying to figure out how they could have lost and, trying to find those missing votes. But the rest of the Republican Party is looking forward and trying to hang on to a narrow Senate majority. As you mentioned, Georgia determines in a lot of ways the legislative range of motion for a Biden agenda. If Democrats can get even narrow control, a 50-seat majority with Vice President Kamala Harris deciding the chamber, they can organize and control the floor and do things, infrastructure and otherwise, they can't do necessarily in the minority. So there is high stakes in Georgia. I think there's a lot of negotiation going on in D.C. related to COVID relief package with an eye toward Georgia, but we won't quite know exactly who holds the levers of power and how the structures are organized until January 5th. And so I think it's an interesting moment to take account of what the possibilities are. And as you say, I think it is a great moment to take stock of what the prospects for infrastructure are looking forward.
Eric, I'm intrigued, given your background and history dealing with majorities and knowing and understanding, nevertheless, that minorities sometimes can sway the discussion. I wonder, regardless of what comes out of Georgia, even if the Democrats end up in the minority, is there room for their voice? How do you see the dynamics playing out?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll say this, I agree with Liam. It's hard to overstate the importance of Georgia. If the Democrats were to win those 2 Senate seats, which I think is unlikely, but certainly possible, they could write a budget reconciliation bill. They could completely rewrite the tax code. I mean, they could make major changes in policy related to a wide range of their priorities. They could also, if they really wanted to be bold, do away with the legislative filibuster. And if they did away with the legislative filibuster, the sky's the limit in terms of healthcare, climate change, a whole range of policy ideas and initiatives. So those 2 Senate seat races will determine so much of what happens. If the Democrats stay in the minority, which is probably the most likely, outcome at this point, they can stop things. They can use the filibuster to sort of grind things to a halt and force negotiations, but they can't set the pace. They can't set the agenda. That really comes from the leadership and the chairmanship of each of the committees. So, minority could throw sand in the gears, but they can't really push an agenda very hard that's a progressive one that they really want to get done.
To piggyback on Eric's point, I would just say that it's probably useful to observe the counterfactual of what might have been expected. Democrats having a working majority, a 51, 52, 53 seat Senate majority, had they picked up some of the seats that they were really targeting, and it would have opened up a lot of things. And so I think in a lot of ways, Democrats are back to the drawing board and sort of right sizing what a plausible agenda can look like, what could get through a 50 seat plus 1 majority. Because as Eric said, I think having that reconciliation tool is absolutely critical. But remember, when you're threading this needle of a 50 seat majority, it has to be things that Bernie Sanders and Joe Manchin can agree on. And so that narrows, the universe of what's possible. But I do think the tools at your disposal when you are in even the slimmest of majorities, things like the Congressional Review Act, things like reconciliation, things like just deciding what comes to the floor are absolutely tremendously important. And I think Eric is if you keep the expectations low, you can only be surprised in the upside. I am very wary of this race as somebody that worked in Republican politics and worked specifically on runoffs in Georgia just about a decade ago. So I think that could go either way. And, it absolutely has, it is an important hinge for looking at what's possible looking forward.
One of the things that is a principle often recognized, sometimes observed in Washington, not always, is that a president's stature can sometimes be enhanced when you've got a split Congress, where the same party, the president's party, does not control both houses. In this case, do you think that principle would hold? Do you think that Biden would be able to accomplish or actually aggregate more stature to his presidency if there were a split, or if there in fact were a Democratic control of the Senate? How do you feel about that?
That's a great question. If you look at Bill Clinton's presidency, when he was dealing with the split Congress, he did what they call triangulation and worked sometimes with Republicans and sometimes with Democrats on different priorities. And I think actually in a way that did enhance his stature, and it made him a little bit less predictable, which I think in Washington enhances your political power to some extent. On the other hand, Joe Biden made a lot of promises with a pretty bold climate-related agenda in July with his Build Back Better initiative. And a lot of that can't get done without Congress. He's just really limited unless he's got a Congress that'll work with him. Given the politically polarized environment we're dealing with, that seems unlikely. I will say, Joe Biden was a senator for, 30 or 40 years from Delaware. He has deep roots in the institution. He knows these people really well. He knows Mitch McConnell well. If anyone can work deals, it's probably going to be Joe Biden. But again, in this divided and polarized environment we're in, even he may not be able to do what he wants.
I completely agree. It's a little bit of a sliding scale when it comes to he doesn't have some of the steep learning curve that a number of recent presidents have had. Obviously, President Trump coming in and not knowing the ways of Washington, but even Barack Obama before him, even President Clinton, as Eric mentioned. So I think that 40 years and just being the ultimate realist in how this thing actually works, how the sausage is made, I think that helps him. But to Eric's point, I think you have to balance that against the changes that have occurred over those 40 years, and particularly the political moment that we're in, where Republicans came so close they can taste it, and everything they do and choose to fight or flee on is going to be based with an eye toward 2022 and ultimately with 2024.
You've raised a point that I frequently observed, having been born and raised in Washington, D.C., and that is that with one exception in my memory, and my memory goes back at least to Carter, meaningfully, and I think the exception is George Herbert Walker Bush, presidents get elected and they come to they come to Washington with sort of the assumption that, well, they're the most powerful person in the universe now. By golly, I have a mandate. I have this entire long sheet of objectives that I announced that I would pursue. And it takes them at least 2 years, sometimes 3 years, at least in a couple of instances. I won't name them. I think they never got the picture, and even in 4 years, that they're actually deluged by incoming. The ability of the president actually to execute on his own plan is extremely limited. And learning the little bit of persuasion and structural power that the presidency actually holds can take a few years. And I think you're right. I think Joe Biden comes with no learning curve there at all, much like George Herbert Walker Bush. I think he comes in and immediately understands where the lines of power and authority are and where they aren't, where he's going to need to use persuasion / begging and pleading, as the case may be. I think that's an advantage. And I would contend it's an advantage also for the Republicans. If they're going to have someone trying to drive an agenda as a Democrat in the White House, ultimately, maybe this is too optimistic, I think that at least the traditional Republican Party would have preferred to be dealing with someone on the Democratic side at 1600 Pennsylvania who is familiar, who knows how to trade, knows how to triangulate, and can be rationally engaged on political issues that have economic or other importance attached to them. So we'll see how that all plays out. Let me ask you a question about party politics and how that plays in. We have, of course, the numbers in Congress and who's going to be in the majority and the minority. We've just gone through the numbers with the Electoral College, so we know how that's come out, and I think pretty clearly. But that isn't it. The conversation, the political conversation in Washington is also influenced by the larger societal and party platform politics. And in the Democratic Party, we're seeing a lot of tension, I think, even now as Biden is populating his nomination slate. We're seeing tensions build on the Democratic side about the policy perspective that should be adopted. And I want to begin to turn this now to infrastructure and, the role of fossil, the role of renewable or non-fossil energy infrastructure, the role of federal lands management for that. How much, so first a broad question to both of you, how much do you see the internecine struggles and tensions of the Democratic Party bleeding over into and hampering this consolidation of a vision and a direction by the Biden administration? Is that going to be a problem for him?
I think it's going to be a huge problem for him. I mean, as we've seen in the postmortem of this last election, this debate that's now raging within the Democratic Party as to whether it should shift to the left or be a more centrist party. That's going to affect his agenda. There are many in Congress who are calling on Biden and will continue to call on Biden to pursue a very progressive leftist agenda through the agencies, through EPA, through Interior, and so forth. I think that will, if he does that, I think it will jeopardize control of the House of Representatives by the Democrats in the midterm election. and I think it will make it much more difficult for him to cut legislative deals with Republicans in Congress. On the other hand, if he doesn't pursue, a somewhat progressive agenda, then he will, risk, constant criticism and backlash from the left. I mean, there's no good option here for him. I've always felt that, either party, if it wanted to govern, indefinitely and successfully, it would govern slightly from the left or slightly from the right. You see big swings of power like we did in 2010, where you have a big, robust, progressive agenda that the Democrats pursue, like on climate change and healthcare, and then they get rebuked in the midterms in a very significant way. And I think if you look at the people that are in the White House now, Ron Klain, Steve Ricchetti, people like that, they have fresh memories of 2010 and the political wipeout that the Democrats suffered. So I think that they are going to resist the calls from members of Congress and some of the progressive NGOs to do a big, robust and aggressive agenda. But we'll see. Only time will tell. And if you look at the pick of Deb Haaland, for example, for Interior, Deb Haaland comes from the left wing of the party. She's pretty strident, pretty aggressive, pretty far left. That signals that I think, at least on those land management issues, which certainly affect infrastructure, affect energy development on public lands, you're going to see a movement to the left. That may have consequences in the West, where I live, for elections in the midterm. John Tester control the House of Representatives and things like that. They're basically trying to thread this needle. How far can they go with their policy agenda without facing a big political backlash? And that's more art than science.
The only thing I would add to that, I think Eric's exactly right. The one thing I'd observed just from looking at the last 4 years and really the last decade on the Republican side, not that it's pure symmetry, but looking at the mirror image of this and how the Republican Party was grappling with sort of the establishment wing of the party versus the Tea Party wing, it's interesting how winning papers over a lot of those differences. And when it's not sort of the speaker versus the insurgents, the squad or House Freedom Caucus or what have you, when you have that overarching leader in the form of a president, I do think that can help to allay some of those tensions. And so, and his appointments and his personnel help to manage that coalition. And so I would say that winning is the best tonic for those sorts of internal tensions. And so that would be my only observation, having watched the power of President Trump to sort of overcome and unite Republicans or against Democrats. And I think you might see some of that as a counterpart point heading into the next term.
Well, I think it's very interesting to watch how much a prospective concern or strategy with respect to the midterms is going to shape even the very earliest actions of the presidency, of the new president coming in. As both of you have remarked upon, it could be quite significant. Let's focus in. You mentioned Deb Haaland as the new nominee, as the Secretary of the Interior. Background, obviously, New Mexico, Democrat, of American Indian heritage, Native Indian heritage, and someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about and dealing with federal lands issues in relation to the Western states, and in relation to different communities, types of communities, impoverished communities, the business community, the Native American community, and others. From her perch, or prospective perch in the Interior Department, one could imagine quite a shift from Secretary David Bernhardt's perspective on the role of the Interior Department. But I'd be interested to hear both of your perspectives on that. I'll start with Eric. I know you've spent so much time in the West. She's coming from an oil and gas state. It's not so simple. Maybe this isn't a New Yorker Democrat who's been placed in the Interior Department. So how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you watch Joe Biden talk about, for example, natural gas extraction during the campaign, it was kind of a painful thing to watch, because he was trying very hard to thread the needle between aligning himself with the progressives who don't want to see fracking, don't want to see oil and gas development at all as part of the sort of keep it in the ground, reaction to climate change. And at the same time, recognizing the political realities in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, where fracking is a very important part of those economies. So the way he threaded that needle was to say, I'm not going to try to ban fracking, but I am going to try to curtail oil and gas development on federal lands. And I think 10 years ago, trying to curtail oil and gas development on federal lands in the West would have been a serious political problem. But if you look at sort of the demographic changes that have occurred in places like Colorado, where I live, and New Mexico, these are now sort of reliably blue states. And I think that that's less of a problem. And I think because of that, they felt more emboldened to appoint a Deb Haaland to that position. And I think that she is, in fact, going to pursue an agenda that's going to make it much more difficult to extract oil and gas from federal lands, and probably also from federal waters, frankly. At the same time, I think we're going to see EPA putting limits on methane emissions from oil and gas extraction, but I don't think you're going to see a significant effort made to try to cripple private lands oil and gas extraction from places like, Texas, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Ohio. It's just too important there, and frankly, the world still needs natural gas, and we've got to get it somewhere. But that's going to be a difficult issue for them to thread over time.
I've been wondering how to read the tea leaves on whether this is going to be more of an anti-fossil or merely a renewable advantage direction coming from the Biden administration. That is to say, on the far left side of the spectrum, there would be an active policy slate of initiatives designed to roll back fossil development on federal lands and elsewhere, perhaps, versus the alternative is really maybe not to promote it as much, but to aggressively promote the non-fossil development, as opposed to attacking the fossil development. I think if you have a split Congress, the latter attack from the White House is far more likely. And my sense is that a Secretary Haaland would be someone who can appreciate the balance being struck there, namely to promote renewable development on federal lands, as opposed to just simply attacking fossil development there. Liam, how do you see the political climate in general for infrastructure? What's the conversation in Congress, and how do you think that conversation may shift in the near term?
Yeah, I think first, taking a step back, you have to think about what the kind of saga of the last 4 to 5 years of the infrastructure conversation has been. Infrastructure Week became a punchline because this was ostensibly a top priority of President Trump, the builder-in-chief, and something where there's clear overlap and incentive for Republicans and Democrats to work together. The song remains the same. This still is a top shelf issue in terms of, where there is nominal agreement. I think what that tells us is the word is very elastic and all-encompassing, and I think the challenge is good in the sense that you can make infrastructure mean anything you want, as narrow or as broad as you want. And I think the challenge on the other side is when Republicans are talking about infrastructure, they mean one thing, and when Democrats are talking about infrastructure, they mean another thing. And that's shown to be true between what even within the Trump administration, Donald Trump was talking about something different than what his administration was putting out in terms of their principles. And a third thing was coming out from the Republican Senate, and a fourth thing was coming out from the Democratic House. So there's just a lot of different visions for this. I think what we need to think about is the driving force in all of this and the forcing mechanism, which is what Congress needs to get anything done, as we're watching as Congress labors to try to get a government funding bill done tonight. But the bogey here in question is the expiration of surface transportation at the end of next fiscal year, so September 30th, 2021. They built themselves a year's more road, no pun intended, this past September, and that's, I think, the driving force here. They need to shoot to get something done specifically on the surface transportation front in the early months, the first at least 6 months of the Biden administration. And so the question is, what does that look like? How broad can that get? Can we get into sort of energy space? But I think the interesting thing from a broader energy and environmental standpoint is what used to be a very dry, kind of nonpartisan surface transportation process is much more inflected with environmental concerns, with climate concerns. And if you read the framework that Pete DeFazio put out that was supported by House Democrats, if you read the Build Back Better proposals, everything, the entire narrative and the through line of all these policies is very much focused on lowering emissions, on boosting renewable technologies, and getting away from combustion engine, that sort of thing. So I think that's kind of where things stand. Again, George is going to determine a lot of this, and it's a question of whether, Senator Capito from West Virginia is holding the EPW gavel. That's going to be a big difference between whether she's calling the shots versus, I don't know, is it Carper, who you tell me, Eric? It's just very different figures in terms of, outcome of two elections. But I do think that's kind of the pace at which we're going to be looking at this. A lot of the spade work has been done over the past 2 years. Again, the Democrats have to probably recalibrate what they had in terms of ambitions, just based on some disappointing elections in the House and some in the Senate. But that's the basis, is going to be trying to get as big a surface transportation bill as you can, trying to do as much you can in that realm, and I think build out from there. The Democratic framework pulls in the other kind of, water infrastructure and ports and the sort of the multimodal transportation world. I think the tricky thing that remains true is there's not an infrastructure committee. It is a sprawling jurisdiction that goes into all sorts of different committees, and the last one to speak is always the toughest, which is, how do you pay for this stuff? And so the Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee, respectively, barely even indulge this stuff until you get the rest of it done, and then you have to find the money, which is the real tough part. And so that's the ultimate conversation that's going to determine all this. Where does the money come from? You have to figure out whether you're going to raise the gas tax, which is always a political headache, whether you're going to do something on vehicle miles traveled. It's the age-old question, and I think we don't still know the answer, but I think Georgia will give us some of the clues.
Well, it is as uncertain as ever. And your reflection that infrastructure is not the subject of its own committee in Congress has, of course, been the devilment for several generations of politicians trying to move infrastructure forward. And in the case of energy infrastructure, we've been seeing a shift socially and politically to some extent in the acceptance of energy infrastructure, pipelines, power lines, both liquid and natural gas, the movement and the forms of movement of traditional energy, whether it's by barge or other marine vessels. There has been some shifting, I think, and a greater awareness and concentration on those modes of moving energy across the country. All of that requires regulatory action by the executive, even under existing legislation. So energy infrastructure project development is highly dependent on how the Biden administration acts, even if Congress finds itself tied in knots and unable to do anything. As I turn our attention then to the perspective of the Biden administration on energy infrastructure, I'm interested, Eric, there's the Climate 21 manifesto or report or a set of recommendations that came out recently that's trying to shape the agenda of the Biden administration on energy and other things. How do you see the shaping of Biden's view on energy infrastructure as a regulatory matter and moving forward there on the balance of renewable and non-renewable?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The effort by the kind of keep it in the ground movement to use attacks on energy infrastructure. I don't mean physical attacks, but I mean legal attacks. Really is sprung from the lack of a comprehensive climate policy in the U.S. or a climate program. So in the absence of that, there's been a lot of NGOs that have filed lawsuits in order to stop pipelines from being developed. LNG terminals, coal export terminals, that sort of thing, in this sort of legal guerrilla war to kind of tamp down development and movement of fossil fuels around the country. The challenge that's going to have is, as we get into sort of a greener and greener energy transition, you're going to need to move, for example, green hydrogen around the country. You're going to need energy infrastructure for electric vehicle charging stations or hydrogen charging stations. So as they negotiate an infrastructure bill, I guess the big question is, Republicans may put on the table that their price for participation is, making energy infrastructure development a little bit easier, and Democrats are going to say, well, we want it easy for our priorities, but we don't want it easy for fossil fuel. And I don't necessarily know how that debate's going to end up, but it could be that we find some places to compromise, and it could be that it just kind of tubes the whole thing. But we'll see. But it's going to be a very, very important debate, because you can't have an energy transition without infrastructure development, and I think that's going to occur to Democrats in Congress. As they move forward with an infrastructure bill debate. I don't think you're going to see the Biden administration doing much administratively to promote, pipeline development and so forth. It's just not in their political DNA to do that. And they may try to use that to sort of leverage concessions on an infrastructure bill. But it's, like I say, they're going to have infrastructure demands that they're going to need for their agenda, and hopefully some sort of a compromise resolution can be found.
I want to pick up a theme that you raise. How does Biden lead on new policy initiatives? And it strikes me that the balance that he can strike himself is on the new initiatives. They can be very much more weighted toward renewables focused, and I'm going to touch on offshore wind in a moment. But he doesn't need to do anything new policy-wise. He already has the existing regulatory and statutory structure to have his agencies approve, as appropriate, any kind of infrastructure, fossil pipelines, power lines, and so forth. He doesn't need to have a new initiative there. And the way he can bridge that is he's building out his climate team with the climate czar and others. And I suspect that we're going to see more consideration of climate and other issues as a matter of permitting policy, reflecting itself not in the denial necessarily, but in a more rigorous examination of fossil proposals for federal permits on federal lands and elsewhere. That would be a traditional approach. I want to pick up the offshore wind, because it seems to me that offshore wind may be one of those relatively few areas where you've got both oil and gas and renewable support. I mean, you've got large traditional oil and gas companies becoming increasingly involved and invested in offshore wind development in the United States. BP PLC's recent investment in the portfolio of Equinor Wind on the east coast of the U.S. is an example of that, a very substantial transaction. It demonstrates an increasing interest of the traditional large oil and gas companies in getting involved on the renewable side. Offshore wind seems to be just a plus one. It's not at the expense of fossil development, because there's none happening offshore the Atlantic coast. It's just additive. It seems to me that's an area where Biden can move even aggressively if he wished to, without sacrificing either his political principles on the Democratic side or needlessly antagonizing and grappling with the oil and gas side in a negative way. Any thoughts on that from either of you?
Well, I think that's right, and I think that it's interesting. The first major offshore wind farm in the United States was developed off Block Island, Rhode Island, and everything from the water line down was built by an oil and gas services company, because they have all that expertise in offshore infrastructure. And I think you're right. As the energy transition unfolds, you're going to see oil and gas companies using their logistical technology, engineering expertise to move into more of these areas. I think offshore wind is one where you're going to see them start to take significant part of that market, which just makes sense. The other areas I think are energy innovation. I think both Republicans and Democrats agree that more money for energy innovation makes a lot of sense. Biden's talked about standing up a so-called ARPA-C at the Department of Energy. I would suspect you would see some support on the Republican side of the aisle for that. But you know, it's really, and a lot of this comes down to the pace of the transition. I think everyone recognizes that a transition is going to happen, and the question is it going to happen in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? And that will be a lot of the debate here. But I think you're right. I think offshore wind, and even some of the renewables projects. I mean, you look at big champions for wind, or Chuck Grassley from Iowa, and the North Dakota senators, and even some of the Texas congressional delegation, because you've got such big wind resources onshore in those states. So renewables is an interesting one. It doesn't entirely cut along partisan lines. And so I think there's some opportunities for compromise and bipartisan cooperation there.
It's a great point. And Liam, I know you're not only a student of, but a deep professor in the area of tax policy. Give us a foreshadowing of what we might expect on tax policy relating to infrastructure development, in particular also wind and renewables and the credits there. What should we be looking for?
Great question. And I think, you know, a lot of this has been teed up because we've been very close to the cusp of, you know, both multi-year extensions and in some cases expansions of various existing renewable tax credits on Christmas Eve around this time last year, and it just kind of fell apart, or at least you know, was chopped down to size. We're in a similar place right now where depending on the fate of a COVID package, you could see a good chunk of tax policy ride. It's likely to default down to something like a one-year extension, but there is a lot of work that's already been done that's ready to take a ride on a moving vehicle. And so looking into next year, I think, you know, in terms of the Democrats' view of these sorts of policies, if you take a peek at the Green Act, which is the House Democrats under Chairman Neal, Mike Thompson's taking the lead on this, but it is really taking the framework of the existing renewable energy tax incentives and boosting those, building on them, implementing some reforms, but really creating or boosting those incentives. You know, I think a lot of this has been hashed out at the Four Corners level among the tax writers, and it's just a matter of finding purchase more broadly. We don't do tax writing in the traditional regular order sense anymore, so it's a little bit trickier. But again, I think the rubric of COVID and COVID recovery and economic stimulus heading into next year could create a situation where it's kind of like, to the extent that we've just lived through if CARES was TARP circa 2008 with the financial crisis, perhaps you could be looking at a Recovery Act, circa 2009, a COVID Recovery Act in 2021. And so I think that's the kind of thing that renewable energy tax credit could seek a ride on. I think the tricky part is, and this constantly flares up, these are kind of on the shelf, they're in the room for those, leadership discussions, and sometimes it flares up where, for instance, during the COVID negotiations, Democrats were asking for an extension of the credits for wind and solar, and McConnell came to the floor and accused them of trying to bring in these other progressive priorities that aren't related to COVID. So there's some food fights that inevitably rise up, but there's always a trade to be had. If you think about back in 2015, when the PATH Act created a lot of these multi-year extensions of solar and wind, it was traded for things on the fossil side. So I think there's room to maneuver to the extent that President Biden can kind of create space for that deal. I think it can clearly happen. I do think that the broader rubric of COVID recovery is ripe for something like this. And I think, more and more, if you look at economic stimulus or even infrastructure, I think these all kind of blend together in terms of, you're going to have an energy component, you're going to have an infrastructure component. You can fit them all in this same frame. And so I think that's the best case. The best thing going for us, other than the Highway Trust Fund running dry, is the idea that the economy needs a boost, and here's how we're going to do it. And much like President Obama did, the vision for a Biden economic recovery is probably a lot of, green infrastructure. Republicans will want that's a place where you can work with Republicans is tax incentives rather than mandates and that sort of thing. So I think there's ripe for something to move. It will depend what happens in the next few days in terms of what's left there. Again, I think we might get a 1-year extension of some of those things. And so it's a question of urgency on some of those, but there's a lot of talk between the tax writers, and again, depending on Georgia, I think we'll have a sense of what's possible.
Thank you, Liam. That's very helpful. We have just a minute or two left, and I want to get a big picture view from each of you about what we might ought to be looking for if we are infrastructure or energy-focused companies, or just stakeholders with a great interest in those topics. We see the unsettled political landscape ahead in Congress. We see slowly taking shape the balancing act that the new President Biden will need to be constantly adjusting for. What are the takeaways for us now? The topics, the developments, the issues that we ought to be focusing on or expecting to fall into place. Eric, do you have thoughts on that? Wisdom for 2021?
Wisdom for 2021, huh? That's a high bar. Well, I think, I'd say it's hard to say right now. We need to kind of wait 2 weeks and see what happens in Georgia before we can really prognosticate. I guess I'm a bit of an optimist. I think both parties recognize the need for an infrastructure bill for a whole range of reasons, including economic stimulus, making us competitive, in terms of moving goods and services around the country and people around the country, and it's overdue. So I'm optimistic that whoever controls the Senate will be able to work, with the minority. We'll be able to work with the administration and pull together an infrastructure bill. It's desperately needed, and I think we're getting to bipartisan agreement on that. Beyond that, it's really hard to say. I mean, you could see a modest climate bill come together that really, again, focuses on on investment in energy innovation and maybe some so-called natural climate solutions issues and a few other dogs and cats. But it certainly won't be a serious or revolutionary piece of work. And then I think the question really comes down to what can Joe Biden do administratively with his existing authorities. Presumably he'll rewrite the Clean Power Plan. Presumably, the Securities and Exchange Commission is going to require publicly held companies to do a lot more in terms of climate risk disclosure and so forth, and what they're doing on that front. What can the FERC do with presumably Rich Glick being the new chairman and his views about taking into account greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation of fossil fuel through pipelines, and then what can Interior do, and EPA do on that front. I think they can do a lot, but I don't think it's going to be revolutionary or transformational. It'll be, picking at the margins.
That, of course, is the focus topic for my one-on-one conversation with Ann Navaro, which will commence in just a moment, where we're going to look closely or more closely at the different regulatory and administrative agencies where policy and other shifts might take place. So that was a perfect segue, Eric, to that conversation. But before we go, we may have lost connection with Liam.
I'm back. I apologize. I lost my audio there.
Not at all. Liam, we have about 30 seconds. But some thoughts and wisdom for 2021, what we should be looking for from a political perspective.
Yeah, I think Eric's exactly right that you should be watching the executive branch and what's possible over there. I think from a legislative standpoint with, caveats for Georgia, I don't think I have a ton of hope for things happening that don't have to happen. But I'll say after 4 years of careening from deadline to deadline and crisis to crisis, I think the regular function of government will be a little bit smoother. I think we're not going to have as much suspense on a day-to-day and month-to-month basis. And I think we can all lower our blood pressure a little bit as we come up on these deadlines. I'm hoping to get a little more rest after we get through these holidays.
Well, I wouldn't mind a little less Sturm und Drang in 2021, that is for sure. But it is an entertaining thing to watch and, of course, of tremendous importance. Liam, Eric, thank you both very, very much for taking your time today, sharing your thoughts and wisdom and perspective. I know our clients appreciate it. And now I get to turn to my colleague and friend, Ann Navaro, for a one-on-one interview with a focus a bit more on the regulatory policy shifts that we should anticipate after the new year. There's lots to talk about there, and Anne is a wonderful person to do it with. She has spent 25 years in the executive branch, including senior lawyer roles and advisor roles in the Justice Department's ENRD, at the Corps of Engineers, and at the Interior Department in both Democratic and Republican administrations. And of course, she's now at Bracewell. And as I mentioned at the outset of the program, we're very proud that she earned Law 360's MVP award this year among environmental lawyers. So welcome, Anne. It's good to have you aboard.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you.
So we have set the stage a little bit with a political discussion, capital P political discussion with Eric and with Liam, and that sets us up to have a more granular conversation about regulatory initiatives, policymaking initiatives, how what the Trump administration has done on environment and natural resources regulation and policy might shift or will shift, some of the mechanics of that, some of the changes in focus and emphasis that we should anticipate. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of that, maybe we can start just with an observation about the people that by President Biden, or anticipated President Biden, is surrounding himself with in the cabinet and in the White House. Any thoughts on that, Anne, to get us started?
Sure, Kevin. And I think given some of his announcements last week, this is a particularly timely conversation. Obviously, he's surrounding himself with a very experienced team when it comes to environmental and natural resource issues, with the addition of some new names. For example, the appointments of Gina McCarthy, or proposed appointments, and John Kerry to focus on climate issues are certainly significant, and they will be able to hit the ground running and have a very clear vision of what they want to accomplish and how to accomplish it. Two other particularly significant names for the kind of environmental policy, natural resource, and species protection sphere are Brenda Mallory for the Council on Environmental Quality and Representative Deb Haaland for Secretary of the Interior. As folks on the phone may know, folks listening may know, Brenda Mallory was general counsel at CEQ for a good part of the Obama administration, and certainly will be able to use that experience in order to quickly focus on the new president's initiatives and policy preferences. I think the proposed nomination of Deb Haaland is particularly interesting for an interior, and certainly is being rightly celebrated in Indian country. We can talk in a little bit more detail about what perspectives and priorities she may bring to Interior.
Those are great observations, and I would add that it's interesting to look at some of the nominations outside of the usual energy and natural resources positions to see what they tell us. And one of them is Jennifer Granholm, nominated for Secretary of DOE, obviously two-term Michigan governor, rising star in the Democratic Party, and well known for her work with respect to rescuing and supporting the auto industry, but also being hailed for her outspoken criticism against oil pipelines like Dakota Access and the Keystone XL pipeline. So comes with some credentials from a political standpoint as to her stance with respect to at least fossil infrastructure development. And that might be an interesting perspective to be adding to DOE at this moment in time. The other thing I would point out is that, again, apart from the energy and natural resources side, it's an experienced team that Biden is bringing on. When you look at his chief of staff, Peg Ron Klein, and counselor to the president, Jeff Sines, people like Susan Rice coming in on domestic policy council. You've mentioned John Kerry and Gina McCarthy. All of these are folks who know how to come into Washington and immediately start picking up the levers of control, decision-making, and communication in a coordinated way to start getting things rolling according to the Biden plan. So let's turn to that. The premise of an assumption of many presidents newly elected is that at the moment they come in, they can just make everything different. And I think they often find that changing executive policy direction, it can be hard. You've been through that process of change in political party and administration, and share some thoughts about how easy, how fast, how hard, how slow changing executive policy direction really is.
Right, sure, Kevin. I certainly have been through it a number of times, and to be a little light about it, I've had to deal with the fallout when it's done improperly, both at the Department of Justice and at the other agencies, because often incoming administrations do try to do things too quickly and they don't do it the right way. And that results in litigation failures or other administrative process failures that are real setbacks. I don't expect to see many of those missteps with the incoming administration, simply because of how experienced the incoming team is going to be. In terms of how easy it is to change executive policy direction, I think as we did with the incoming Trump administration and with the Obama administration when it came in, I think we're going to see different categories of changes in policy that are going to be done in a very deliberate fashion. I imagine we will see a number of executive orders out of the White House very early in the new administration that address big picture policy that can be affected via executive order. For example, I would expect the incoming Biden administration to issue an executive order relating to climate change and how agencies should now be thinking about that and prioritizing it in their reviews and decision making. I expect similarly agencies to take a look at what sort of guidance and internal policies they can either change from existing policy or issue new guidance and internal policies that will start to steer the agencies in the preferred policy direction of the new administration. Of course, regulations are much harder to change and take a good deal longer, but I expect there will be some kind of low-hanging fruit regulations that the new administration will look at very, very early on and perhaps begin very early rulemakings. Those may include things like the regulation implementing the National Environmental Policy Act. They may include the regulation defining the geographic jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. But I do expect the new administration to be pretty methodical given this team's understanding of and experience with the administrative process.
I want to pick up that last element in particular, and that is administrative process. Obviously, the Administrative Procedure Act governs the rulemaking process, which is not applicable to all policy, but certainly to rulemaking itself. And you're essentially pointing out that the experience of this team will recognize the importance of building an administrative record and proceeding, as you said, methodically to make regulatory change. And yet I also have the sense that there are going to be some animating principles from which all their rulemaking and policy initiatives are going to flow. That may be an overly comprehensive statement, but I think of two in particular. It seems like climate change and environmental justice are going to be leading principles, defining, shaping, coloring, and prodding, if you will, forward the kinds of policy and regulatory change that I anticipate seeing. And those two, and maybe there are others, are principles or areas of focus and emphasis beyond the statutory requirement, beyond what the mandate from Congress necessarily is. Can you comment on that?
Sure, Kevin, I absolutely agree. I think those are going to be two of the primary animating principles in this area for the administration. And I do think beyond even what the statutes may require, that goes back to what I suggested on executive orders, which is I anticipate that there will be early executive orders directing the agencies to essentially put climate, environmental justice front and center in their decision making and in their policy reviews. I think, for example, folks have criticized the new NEPA rule, arguing that it doesn't require the agencies to consider climate change. That may be the case, but I don't think that is going to prevent the new administration from ensuring that the agencies do adequately consider climate change. And so I think we will see that policy directive coming out of the White House and being implemented by CEQ even before they make any effort to revise the new NEPA rules. And then in terms of animating principles, I actually think there's a third one that is perhaps a little bit lesser, but is kind of at the front of my mind because of what happened at the Trump Interior Department, and that is mitigation, which is, maybe kind of an in the weeds thing, and most people expect to have to do mitigation for permitting. But at least at the Department of the Interior in the Obama administration, there was sort of a broader push to require mitigation for use of public resources on public lands that hadn't been required earlier. There was more of an emphasis on mitigation for species impacts, perhaps beyond what is necessarily required by the law. And the current Department of the Interior kind of made an effort to roll that back because their view was that it was more than what the law requires. So I do kind of expect a third principle to be the notion that, if there are going to be impacts to public and common resources, mitigation is going to be an extremely important component of the government's review.
I think you're very right to add that to the mix. And that, of course, makes itself felt through new permitting for project infrastructure development. I think whether you're building pipelines or solar facilities or offshore wind facilities, power lines, whatever the infrastructure may be, a lot of it energy infrastructure, because of the size, scale, especially of linear projects, you often will have some impacts, and seeking to design a project's approach to mitigation in a way that'll satisfy all the different agencies involved is a very complex undertaking. And one of the things I'll be looking for example, is how much uniformity there is in mitigation expectations across the different regions of the federal government. When you've got trans-jurisdictional projects within the United States, that means interstate projects or projects that run across regions, whether they're district office regions of engineers or regions of EPA or other institutions of government. We frequently confront the challenge that the interpretation of, say, mitigation requirements might vary. Makes it complicated for infrastructure to create a clear, certain path forward through the permitting process. So that's a great point on mitigation. I want to turn back to climate for Brenda Mallory, of course, joining as the head of the Council of Environmental Quality, and as you point, only the general counsel there. In fact, she was there during a time when the then administration, prior to the Trump administration, set new policy on climate change. And so she's experienced with some of the issues there from a policy standpoint, from a practical standpoint. She's had her head and hands in that material for quite some time. So I think that we should expect something coming pretty quickly out from CEQ. One of the questions that gets raised then, Anne, is what is the scope legally for an agency that is reviewing a permit application to consider denying that application as a result of the environmental studies? If the statute under which the permit is being issued says the criteria are A, B, C, and D, and they do not include among those A, B, C, D, climate or environmental justice, but you do a historic review under the National Historic Preservation Act, you do an environmental impact analysis, you do that on the side, and you come up with some impacts that you don't like. What's the room there from a legal standpoint for them to deny a project permit even if it meets the statutory criteria under the permitting regime?
I think that's a great question, Kevin. And I think it's obviously going to be very statute specific in terms of what statute gives the agency the permitting authority that's at issue. I think that is a question that has not been well fleshed out, frankly, or litigated, because I don't think, at least in kind of my world, I have not often seen agencies denying permits or other types of permissions for reasons beyond their kind of prescribed statutory jurisdiction. I certainly think a lot of folks would take the view that broad statutes like NEPA or the National Historic Preservation Act essentially supplement an agency's authority, and because they require agencies to take certain things into account, they necessarily then give the agencies the authority to, to act on that information as they see fit. One example that springs to mind is the Corps of Engineers permitting authority under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which obviously is fairly narrow, and the statute and the regulations prescribe the manner in which the Corps should make the decision. At the same time, the Corps has little recognized but very broad public interest regulations that require it, separate from NEPA, to undertake a broad public interest review before it makes a permit decision. And I think it's never been clear to anyone whether the Corps could go ahead and deny a permit based on, for example, its assessment of the economic impact of the permit that is being sought, which is one of the issues raised under the public interest review. So I think that's a very interesting question, and it may be one that is joined for different agencies in this administration.
I think we're going to see it emerge relatively early in actions being taken by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, acting, for example, under another public interest-based statute, the Natural Gas Act. As a lot of the audience knows, the Natural Gas Act has a process for reviewing applications for interstate natural gas pipelines, for example, that includes a review relating to the public interest, in particular, the public convenience and necessity. And the question being raised in that context is, to what extent is the public convenience and necessity entirely or largely an economic need assessment versus a broader assessment of needs beyond the economic that might include environmental issues and climate issues, environmental justice issues, in a way that makes the statutory criteria of the Natural Gas Act actually comprehensive of some of these issues in a way that they haven't been before. And with changing leadership at the FERC, I think that there'll be a renewal of that debate, which has been, I would say, quietly raging among the FERC set, myself included, for some years. Let me turn now to policy governing federal lands and policy governing tribal lands of one kind or another. And maybe we should start just with distinguishing the two and establishing what the federal role is with respect to each. Anne, can you start us there?
Sure. So as most people listening probably know, federal lands include a broad swath of the country and, range from lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management to lands managed by the Forest Service. Even the Corps of Engineers has a fairly significant chunk of public lands, even though they are off limits for many uses. And then tribal lands, of course, are lands held in trust by the federal government for the tribes. And the tribes, they include reservations, they include allotted lands, and the Department of the Interior takes an active role along with the tribes in managing those lands.
When we look to the principles that we think will be animating the new administration, among them environmental justice, climate change, mitigation policy. I think clearly there's also a desire very strongly to push forward on non-fossil fuel energy sources in the United States, whether it's wind, solar, ultimately also hydrogen, battery storage, a lot of new technology, some of it already present in our economy, some of it on the cusp of becoming present in our economy. Federal lands and tribal lands play a role there because of the amount of natural resources and energy that's available from them. How do you see access? Let's start with federal lands first. How do you see access to federal lands changing as a result of policy changes? In particular, do you see a strong impetus to curtail fossil development on federal lands, or do you see more of an advantaging of renewable energy resource development on federal lands? Where's that heading?
Well, I think we're going to see a combination of those things. Certainly, President-elect Biden has indicated that he's interested in not allowing any additional oil and gas development on federal lands. I think there is a current set of active leases and permits to drill out there that will mean that active production from public lands continues for the foreseeable future. But I expect the Biden administration to be looking for opportunities to not add to that inventory of leases that are already out there. And I expect that in addition to kind of big picture policy direction where there's perhaps a leasing moratorium or something to that effect, you could see other perhaps less visible measures taken to kind of disadvantage certain types of uses of public lands and advantage others. For example, just think about shifting funding, between offices to the extent possible without congressional authorization, directing more resources to the Office of BOEM dealing with offshore wind and taking resources from the offices of BLM that deal with oil and gas development. So there could be all sorts of highly visible and less visible ways that a new administration tries to advantage certain types of resource development and, as you said, disadvantage others. I could also see agencies, for example, the Department of the Interior, kind of taking a pause, doing a leasing moratorium like the Obama administration did for coal, in order to take a more holistic look and evaluate an approach to managing public lands that starts to minimize oil and gas development. And then kind of moving on to some of the tribal issues, I think, that also gets very interesting. There are certainly tribes who actively favor oil and gas development on tribal lands. And then there are tribes that do not favor oil and gas development on tribal lands. There are tribes that are obviously very active in terms of policy issues, even outside of reservation lands or other tribal lands. And folks listening may recall that Deb Haaland, who's been nominated to be Secretary of the Interior, actually attended the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so I would expect her, assuming she's confirmed, to be very attentive to tribal preferences with respect to development, not only of tribal resources, but also with respect to development of other public resources that were historically in the realm of tribal interests.
It's an interesting observation about nominee Holland that she participated in the Dakota Access protests personally. I think that's also notable because it is a long-term representative from New Mexico. It shows a leadership style. It is a leadership style that is very kinetic. It's active. It's personally engaged. It's reaching down and making herself part of boots on the ground decisions and actions. And I think we're going to see that kind of very personally activated leadership from Deb Haaland if her nomination succeeds, and possibly also from others in the cabinet and in White House advisory positions. I think there's a real active personal engagement element to many of the nominations that I've seen. Let me turn for a moment to another aspect of public lands, and that's preservation. When we, at the end of the Obama administration in particular, and then early in the Trump administration, there was a bit of a push and pull on the use of the Antiquities Act and other similar statutes to take federal lands or public lands out of circulation for resource development in interesting ways. Can you comment on where you think the Biden administration might be thinking on preservation issues?
Sure. That's an interesting question. I actually hadn't thought about the Antiquities Act issues in a while, but I certainly do expect that the incoming Biden administration will look closely at its ability to kind of reconstitute some of the big national monuments that were reduced by the Trump administration, including Bears Ears and the Grand Staircase Escalante monument. And certainly to consider very active use of available statutory tools to conserve additional areas of public lands in perpetuity, kind of consistent with the 30% figure that I think, we've heard going around in various environmental groups with a goal of conserving 30% of open space kind of worldwide. So I expect the new administration to be looking very closely at areas that perhaps should be set apart from any further development. Taking one example, of course, the Obama administration went through a very arduous and complex process to try to avoid listing sage grouse in the West. And as part of that process, set aside, a good amount of public land that would not be impacted by oil and gas or other development in order to protect the bird. The Trump administration revised that approach, and it's all been tied up in litigation. But I think that's another example of a tool, the type of tool that a Biden administration could use to try to identify areas that it believes should be set aside and not be open to use in development.
We've certainly seen that push and pull on withdrawal of lands also in the context of the Outer Continental Shelf. The Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act under Section 12A allows the president to make withdrawals of designated areas, not per se for preservation as a monument, but just to take it out of contention for development under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, typically for oil and gas development. But just in the last few months, we've seen the Trump administration attempt to use that authority to take out of circulation some Atlantic coast OCS areas from circulation for possible development for offshore wind. And from the North Carolina border, basically southward to Florida. That's an instance where we might very well see the Biden administration change, not by withdrawing, but by ending or seeking to end a withdrawal that was attempted by the prior administration in order to allow development on public lands, in this case, development of offshore wind resources on the Atlantic coast. So it'll be an interesting mix, and rising up in the middle of that will be issues of a legal nature under the Antiquities Act, under OXLA, perhaps as well, about how much authority a president has not just to withdraw, but to end the withdrawal and resume consideration of lands that had been previously withdrawn for development of some kind. So
Yeah,
much.
I agree, Kevin. And one really interesting thing about that is that, of course, there has been litigation for the past 4 years, particularly under the Antiquities Act, regarding, the extent of the president's authority, but that litigation hasn't been resolved. So there are still a lot of open questions about the extent of the president's authority in this area.
Well, it's clear to me, Anne, that we're in for a sea change in perspective. Maybe some of the top line takeaways that I'm hearing from your remarks include that there will be some themes that will be driving policy consideration. Climate will be among them. Environmental justice will be among them. You pointed out as well mitigation, the crucial role that mitigation has played or can play in governing decision making on new projects, for example, for permitting. I think we're seeing an experienced group of people come into cabinet positions and White House advisory positions that are already steeped to an extent in energy and natural resource issues and the policy debate that surrounds them, and where the decision making lies, where the opportunity, the art of the possible, if you will, for making new and different decisions on policy can be found. I think a third takeaway that I'm hearing is that there's a bunch we still don't know yet. We don't know the final shape, of course, of the administration and all its personnel. We don't know how the political winds, as Eric and Liam and I discussed earlier, will shape the ability of the Biden administration to make its new perspective felt. It depends a lot on the Georgia election runoff in January, but perhaps it also depends a good bit on the ability of two different parties in two different houses of Congress and different parties as between Congress and the White House to find ways of working together. And do you have any final thoughts? You've seen many presidential administrations come and go. Looking forward ahead to a Biden administration, any thoughts about how we can position ourselves, at least mentally, for the changes to come?
Well, that's a good question. I think, we position ourselves by being very attentive to the various appointments and the hires that are made in the administration, even well below the cabinet level, because that, I think, will be very indicative of the direction that we are heading. And I just wanted to close out with one point that we didn't really touch on, but I think will be interesting to watch, which is what will happen with the Trump administration's various streamlining initiatives that were aimed at trying to ease permitting requirements. I think there will certainly be a group of people who have a knee-jerk reaction to kind of roll back anything done by the Trump administration. But as they say, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And the Biden administration will also be wanting to facilitate renewable projects such as offshore wind and other similar things. So it will be interesting to see the approach that the incoming administration takes to permitting and whether, in fact, they maintain and try to refine some of those initiatives that were aimed at efficiencies in the process.
I couldn't agree more, Anne. And whether it's one federal decision or other aspects of streamlining, in particular for infrastructure, the Trump administration did try to set some changes in the usual patterns of federal engagement with new projects. Some of that, I think, was really welcomed by all involved in project development of energy infrastructure and other forms of infrastructure. Some of that's, of course, in litigation, and we may see how it fares. Some of it is very much in alignment with the interests of the Biden administration to stimulate the economy, to stimulate growth and jobs, to develop a new, more renewables-focused infrastructure within the country. So it will be interesting to see all of that play out, and I hope that we end up living not just in interesting times, as the proverb goes, but in good times ahead. So, Anne, thank you very much for your thought and insight, and to the audience, all our friends and clients, thank you for participating in our biennial environmental seminars at Bracewell. We missed seeing you in person. We missed our personal interactions with you. We hope to recoup that in the coming year. Meanwhile, stay safe, and enjoy the holiday season and the start to the new year.
Thanks very much.